Welcome to Confident Faith, Apologetics for Everyone.
The aim of this course is to strengthen your confidence and ability to engage with the heartfelt questions and concerns people have today about the Christian faith.
My name is Tash Edwards.
And I'm Simon Edwards.
And as you can hear from our accents, we are Australians living in the UK.
I'm a speaker and tutor for the Oxford Centre for Christian Apologetics.
And I've been in church leadership for over 15 years.
And together we're passionate about addressing the deep questions of our culture with meaningful answers found in the Christian faith.
And we're so glad that you've decided to join us on this course.
So let us begin by sharing a story with you. It was a little while ago. I was speaking at a university to an auditorium of students about the Christian faith, and afterwards there were several students hanging around who wanted to talk more, and I soon found myself in conversation with an atheist, in this case a very strident atheist, and I discovered, as is so often the case, that they grew up going to church. And their story went something like this. I went to church every Sunday and attended Sunday school. When I got older, I started having doubts about whether Christianity was true, doubts about whether science actually disproved the Bible, doubts about whether suffering actually disproved the existence of a good God. Questions like that. But when I took my questions to my parents or my pastors, they couldn't respond. They had no answers, or worse, they told me I was lacking faith for even asking those questions. Eventually, I decided I couldn't just keep on believing what I felt must be a lie, so now I'm an atheist and I feel so much better.
Yeah, Simon, your story reminds me of the experience of the comedian Ricky Gervais, who says that as an 8-year-old kid, he went to church and believed in God. And then one day when he's drawing a picture of his hero, Jesus on the cross, his much older brother walks in and asks, "Why do you believe in God?" Gervais writes, "Just a simple question, but my mum panicked. 'Bob,' she said in a tone that I knew meant, 'Shut up!' Why was that a bad thing to ask, I wondered. If there was a God and my faith was strong, it didn't matter what people said. Hang on. There is no God. He knows it and she knows it deep down. It was as simple as that. I started thinking about it and asking more questions, and within an hour, I was an atheist."
We want to talk to you in these sessions about the importance of having a thoughtful faith, by which we mean a faith that's not afraid to think. Not afraid to think about what, you ask?
Well, not afraid to think about the big questions of life and how Christianity answers them, and not afraid to think about the tough questions or objections that people in our culture have today about God or Jesus or the Bible. Now, why is it so important that we are able to do this? Why is it so important to have a thinking faith? Well, we want to suggest for at least 3 reasons.
Firstly, having a thinking faith will strengthen our own faith as believers, as well as the faith of those around us, including our families. Because knowing that there are good answers to the tough questions people have about faith can help us to keep trusting God through times of personal doubt or even dryness.
Secondly, having a thinking faith will strengthen our conversational witness and evangelism as believers, because the more that we're able to respond thoughtfully to people's tough questions and objections, the more likely it is that people will give the Christian message a fair hearing.
And thirdly, the more Christians there are with a thinking faith, the greater will the church's influence be on society and culture, because the more we're able to contribute intelligently to the public conversation on issues that matter to all of us as human beings, the more receptive and open our culture will be to a Christian perspective on life and human flourishing.
It's important to realize that although Christianity is most fundamentally about having a living and interactive relationship with God, it's also a comprehensive philosophy of life, or what sociologists sometimes call a worldview. Now, a worldview is a system of ideas, assumptions, or stories that we tell ourselves about reality, affecting at the most fundamental level how we see and approach life in this world. It is the lens of what life is ultimately all about that directs our daily decisions and actions.
And whether they are consciously aware of it or not, almost everyone has a worldview because almost everyone has beliefs. Some people's beliefs are religious and some are not. But if we were to ask someone 4 big questions, where did life come from? what is the meaning of life, how should one live their life, and what happens to us when we die, we would be well on the way to getting to understand their worldview.
Now, obviously, Christianity is not the only worldview on offer today, nor is it the only worldview on trial, because in a sense, all the different worldviews, both religious and non-religious, are called to give an account of how they make most sense of the world and of life's big questions.
And if I may share personally, one of the factors in my becoming a Christian was the discovery that Christianity made such remarkable sense of the world and of life's biggest questions. I grew up in a non-religious family background, but I remember standing in the school playground at lunchtime as a teenager, wondering to myself whether it's true that we're all just here as a result of a random and unguided process of time plus matter plus chance. We live for 80 or 90 years if we're lucky, and then we die, and that's it. Game over. And everything we love, everything we've achieved, everything we are just dissipates into dust. But if that's true, I thought to myself, it would seem to render our lives meaningless. I wonder if it is true. That question sparked the beginning of a long journey of investigation. And the more I investigated what the different worldviews on offer had to say about life, and the more I thought about this marvelous and complex universe that we find ourselves in, it seemed to me that Christianity was the only worldview that, like the right key, exactly fitted the lock, and in doing so, unlocked the meaning behind it all.
The writer and Oxford Don C.S. Lewis likewise points to Christianity's remarkable ability to make sense of life in all of its multifaceted complexity as one of the reasons for his coming to faith. In a paper given to the Oxford Socratic Club, Lewis wrote, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else."
Now, it turns out, if you study a bit of church history, that the church has been in the practice of thinking deeply about how Christian faith answers the big questions of life, as well as the tough objections posed by people of all faiths and none, for centuries. In fact, Jesus himself often faced difficult and even hostile questions. Historically, this aspect of Christian life and practice has been called Christian apologetics.
Now, it's a phrase that sounds a bit strange to our modern English ears because the word apologetics sounds to us like it has something to do with saying sorry. But Christian apologetics is not about saying sorry for your faith. It's about giving reasons for your faith.
Right, because the word apologetics comes from the Greek word apologia, which means a reasoned defense or reasoned answer. It's the same word that would be used, for example, to describe the defense a lawyer would give in a court of law, and it's also a word we find in the Apostle Peter's first letter to the church.
Right. In 1 Peter 3 verse 15 we read, "But in your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope you have, but do this with gentleness and respect."
He says, always be prepared to give an answer, in Greek an apologia, for the hope that is in you.
I really love that Peter also tells us in this verse to answer people with gentleness and respect. In other words, in your answering, don't be aggressive, and in your defending, don't be defensive. Instead, be gracious. Be winsome.
Exactly. Apologetics is not a hammer we use to hit people over the head with the truth. Apologetics is simply about giving people reasons for why we believe what we believe. And the point is not to win arguments, it's to win people to Jesus, to help them to see that he's true and he's good and he's what we all need.
Also, being willing to respond thoughtfully to the tough questions and objections of the day is an important aspect of spiritual warfare. But the battle is not against other people. It's against the false ideas and bad arguments that are set up against the knowledge of God. As Paul writes in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ.
And so the question is, Are we aware of the arguments that are set up against the knowledge of God? Are we aware of the objections to belief in God that our young people, for example, are being confronted with from friends, teachers, classmates, or neighbours, as well as that they're asking themselves? And are we willing to engage with the tough questions?
Now's a good place for us to pause this session and give you some time to discuss what we've talked about so far, including the importance of having a faith that's not afraid to think and not afraid to engage with people's thoughtful questions.
Welcome back to the second half of session 1.
This is Confident Faith Apologetics for Everyone. Someone who is very good at giving reasons for his faith and at responding to people's tough questions was the Apostle Paul. We read in Acts 17, for example, that when Paul met with the Jews, that he reasoned with them and explained and proved from the scriptures that Jesus was the Messiah. Those are the verbs used: reasoning, explaining, and proving. In other words, when Paul did evangelism, he intentionally appealed to people's reason. He invited them to think. And we see that the Lord worked through that, and that some were persuaded by Paul's reasoning.
And then later in Acts chapter 17, we also see Paul reasoning with a different group of people, with leading Greek thinkers in the public square in Athens. And in verse 28, we read that he quotes from their very own Greek poets, Epimenides and Aratus, who, though pagan Greek philosophers, said some true things about God. For in him we live and move and have our being, and we are his offspring. And that Paul also references their spiritual seeking as a people. He speaks about their altar to the unknown God, and then uses that as a springboard to move the conversation on from the unknown God to the God of all heaven and all earth, who can be known because he's made himself knowable in Jesus Christ.
Now, if we were to ask you whether our context for sharing our faith today is more like the Jewish context where people are familiar with the scriptures, or more like the Greek context where people are unfamiliar with the scriptures, it's actually a tricky question, because on the one hand, the Bible has had a bigger influence on Western thought and culture than any other book or set of beliefs. But on the other hand, most people today don't read the Bible or go to church anymore.
In fact, many people today view belief in God as irrational, irrelevant, and possibly even immoral, and consider talking about God or about Jesus in public as a bit inappropriate, socially awkward, perhaps even offensive. So we find ourselves as Christians in an interesting situation, living in a cultural moment that is post-Christian in its attitude, but pre-Christian in its understanding. In other words, when it comes to Christian faith, our culture is increasingly rejecting that which it increasingly no longer understands.
And what that means practically is that when it comes to sharing our faith with others and answering people's questions, that it's no longer sufficient for us to just quote a few key Bible verses and consider the job done. In addition to sharing God's truth from the Bible, which is absolutely essential and necessary, we also need to be prepared to face follow-up questions that people who didn't grow up going to church might naturally ask.
Questions like, yes, but why should I trust the Bible? How do we know it's reliable? And how do we know Jesus Christ even existed? And hasn't science done away with God anyway?
Yeah, questions like that. Questions that honest and sincere seekers of truth are going to ask. And so we need to be willing, just like the Apostle Paul was, to meet people where they're at and to build bridges of understanding from where they're at to the good news about Jesus, and from the good news of Jesus to where they're at.
In fact, even just helping people to see that you don't have to leave your brain at the door in order to become a Christian can often be the final step in a person's journey to Jesus. I saw for myself how this can be true the day I gave my first ever apologetics-based talk. It was to a small group of people in a small village on the topic of science and Christianity. And I was absolutely thrilled to discover later that night that one of the listeners committed his life to Jesus after the talk. This gentleman was a doctor, a respected member of his community, 70 years old, still practicing as a doctor, a lovely man who had been attending church for years with his wife, but who couldn't, in all honesty, commit to Christ because of his understanding that science and Christian faith were somehow irreconcilable. But what I had said that night, by God's grace, had helped remove for him that final intellectual stumbling block, this lie that science and faith were enemies had been the only thing holding him back, and he gave his life to Christ that night. The Bible teacher John Stott used to say that evangelism and apologetics are really just two sides of the same coin. Evangelism is about sharing the good news, and apologetics is about clearing away obstacles that are preventing people from seeing that this news is good news as well as true news.
Now, does that mean in order to do evangelism today, we all have to become experts in science or in history or in philosophy?
No, thankfully it doesn't, but we do want to do what we can to help people see that Christian faith is not hostile to science or to history or to reason, and that Christian faith actually invites people to think and to reason and to ask questions because God Himself takes people and their questions seriously.
When it comes to answering the tough questions of our culture, wouldn't it be great if we were just like the Apostle Paul, able to confidently engage with the thinkers and skeptics of his day in the marketplace of ideas? That would be amazing. But the reality for most of us is that when it comes to dealing with the tough questions of our culture, we feel less like the Apostle Paul and more like an ordinary Paul who just feels frightened. We can be intimidated because we feel that there are just so many different tough questions and objections that people might raise, and we don't know where or how to start dealing with them all. But something that is helpful to bear in mind is that the tough objections that seekers or skeptics might have about Christianity tend to fall into one of three broad categories.
Either people find it difficult to believe that Christianity could possibly be true, or difficult to believe that it could possibly be good, or difficult to believe that it could possibly help in any practical way, which means that objections people have against Christianity tend to fall into one of three categories. That Christianity is either irrational, there is no God, immoral, I don't like your God, or irrelevant, I don't need your God. In other words, any tough question or objection people have about faith is going to be a variation of one of the following questions. Is it true? Is it good? Does it work?
So, for example, questions within the category of is it true might be questions like, has science disproved God? Or is Christianity just a psychological crutch? Questions that fall within the category of is it good could be, if God is so good, why is there so much suffering? Or why is it that religion is the number one cause of violence in the world? And then questions that fall into the category of does it work are questions like, do I really need faith in God to be happy? Or do I need religion to be good?
And you can see how if I'm motivated by what is true, I won't be interested in believing in something I think is irrational. And if I'm motivated by what is good, I won't invest in something that I feel is immoral. And if I'm motivated by what works in real life, I won't commit to something that is irrelevant to real life. Each of us will naturally find that one of these three categories is our primary motivating question, even if all of them ultimately matter. So for me on my journey of faith, it was definitely the first category, is it true? That was the most important question of the three. I always wanted to align my life with what was true. And if in my journey of investigation I'd come to the conclusion that, for example, atheism was true, then I would have been an atheist. Not because I would have wanted to be an atheist, but because intellectual integrity would have demanded it.
Whereas for me, I would say the primary motivating question was the question of what is good or beautiful. Not all of us are the same, are we? It will be different for different people. And so it's useful for us to recognize this and to realize that the primary motivating question for the person we're in conversation with might just be different to our primary motivating question. And so our thinking and talking about Christian faith needs to be well-rounded, helping people to see that Christianity is true, but also that it's practically relevant as well as morally attractive. That it's not merely a series of external truth propositions to be confirmed, but also something internal that is to be experienced.
It also helps for us to bear in mind that all three questions, is it true, is it good, does it work, are all important questions in the sense that all three questions can be the means by which God leads people on a journey towards Jesus Christ. Why? Well, because Jesus is not only the truth, he's also the way and also the life. He's all true and all good and all life. And so all three questions, is it true, is it good, and does it work, ultimately find their fulfillment in Christ with a resounding yes and amen.
And in fact, those three questions will form the theme for the following sessions in this series. Is it true? Is it good? And does it work? And then in our final session, we will look at how to have conversations about our faith with people who don't go to church, and how to respond to the difficult questions people have about faith in a way that really connects with people and draws them in rather than pushing them away.
Thanks so much for joining us for session 1 of Confident Faith, Apologetics for everyone, including you. And you. And you.
And you.
And don't forget you.
Yeah, that's right.
Together we've thought about the importance of having a thinking faith that's not afraid to engage with some of the big questions and concerns that people have today about God, Jesus, and the Bible. I think we're looking forward to seeing these guys again in session 2. What do you think, Tash?
I think we are too.
And what are we going to be looking at?
Well, we're going to be looking at the topic, is it true?
Is it true? Great question. See you then.